Where? It seems like it's live on Twitch and YouTube. You want me to send you the YouTube link? Cool. Let's do it.
Hey everyone, it's Raji and Tom, the power duo, and we're back again with another office hours. Today we're going to be talking about prototyping. Tom knows quite a bit about prototyping, but I also do as well. For those that don't know, Tom, go ahead and introduce yourself. Tell the folks, the fine folks here, what you do here at Figma. What's your favorite thing about Figma? Let's hear it.
Sure. I'm a designer advocate here at Figma. I have always worked remotely for the company. I'm located just outside of Toronto. I was sort of like the first designer advocate on the team, and huge part of our role here is interacting with our users and other passionate folks that enjoy using Figma. And pretty much, I think that I can speak on your behalf as well from this perspective, is that pretty much everyone on our team started out as a passionate Figma user using Figma in our own design workflows prior to joining the company. So we're all designers on the team and love talking shop. So ask us as many questions as you can today in the stream.
Yeah, I agree with that. We're super nerdy, definitely product designers and or programmers. I know that Tom and I are both front-end developers as well. We were just nerding out this morning about I was actually showing him a project of mine with Vue.js, and I know he does stuff in Svelte. So super active in the community with regards to that, but as well as just passionate Figma users. We definitely love this product. We have a lot to show you today. So, what was your favorite part about the product again, Tom?
Favorite part about the product? I mean, long term, I've just loved the collaborative aspect of it, and also just nerding out on components. But I guess in recent times, maybe the plugin API. The plugin API has been nice to just be able to make things for yourself to just, uh, either speed up your own workflows if there's like little things that you like to do. But yeah, I pretty much at all times love nerding out on the plugin API.
Yeah, that's definitely true of Tom. And I am definitely trying to dip my toes into the plugin API. I think what I love most about this product is I don't in part the community. The community feels a lot like the old web to me, like 10 years ago, where everybody had this renewed sense of excitement and passion. And maybe it's just because the technology is so fresh. A lot of this multiplayer thing and the ability for us to both collaborate in a file, it just feels so different and so new, as well as having so many capabilities in this tool, like prototyping and commenting and being able to iterate designs live like this, the single source of truth thing. Uh, I could go on, but I won't, just because I want to go on about the prototyping.
Yeah, no, that sounds good. But also, just maybe one thing to just kind of close out on that is, I think like I remember some of the sentiment around when, Figma was like really new, like before you could even kind of like pay for any form of like Figma Pro tier or even the organization tier. Um, there was like kind of this, why would anyone want to work in a browser, or why would anyone want to work live? And that was actually one of the things that kind of appealed to me a lot. And it's I can't tell you how fun it is to just jam with somebody in the same file when you've got like a really really vague idea of how you're going to solve a problem, and you can both just kind of like forget about any sort of judgment on bad ideas, or like how you've heard me talk about the pencil tool, just like sketching out really
Right.
rough ideas. It's so much fun.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. It and I think one of the things you said too was like a lot of skepticism about a browser-based tool. I had it too. I was just like native, man. You got to go native. There's no way to have it be as snappy. I was sincerely blown away when we were working on art boards and frames that had like hundreds and hundreds of frames, and seeing how buttery and smooth it was. I think it basically went like this for me. I was wrong. All right. So I'm okay with using this tool now. It's super fast. Uh, and I love that no matter where, like, I've had a lot of times where I have my laptop with me and maybe it's not set up with all my software, and or I'm on I'm on a Windows laptop or my son's desktop, and I'm like, I just want to jump into this file real quick. I had this idea, and I can just log it in the browser. There's no installation of software or anything like that, and that feels like really really nice.
For sure.
All right, so we're just going to change this stream to just wax on about Figma. Is that what we're doing now? All right.
No, take it away with prototype. I'm
All right.
also loving all the commentary in the chat about the SpaceX NASA launch today.
Yeah,
Which
Tom's a special breed of nerd. That's definitely all on that.
there's some we got the NASA standards manual. We've got the lunar lander off camera. I guess you're right. I've got the Lego Saturn V rocket, so I'm a space nerd too. I'll definitely be tuning into that later as well. But
So,
thank you for joining us today.
sounds like you can actually bring your Lego set in closer for people to take a look at it too, while I'm moving through my portion of this. All right, awesome. Well, let's get started. One thing, we're going to do this a little bit differently. Tom and I are going to kind of go back and forth on this. I'll show something, he'll show something, I'll show something. That way, if you're sick of me, you don't have to hear me wax on. Boom, a fresh new voice appears. So, all right. So, anyways, let's just kind of talk about really quick how this is set up. In this one, we're just going to talk about prototype swaps and overlays. So, what I've got here is just a bunch of components, quite honestly, from a project I was working on over the weekend. Little icons, probably nothing new that you've seen here, just some icons. We've got a few, I don't know, like little bits of text here, and it's just a reusable component. These are just meant to be a menu that's describing a bunch of fonts. We're not going to talk too much about that. So I've slapped out here one of these little text buttons, and what I'd like to do with this thing in my prototype is I'd like to have like a hover state for that, and I'd also like to have a click state as well. And the way that I'm going to achieve this is using overlays, as well as click events, as well as swapping of those overlays. So let's just go over the prototype panel here. We'll see the anatomy of how this is set up. So I've got this button, and on this button, I have a while hovering action. So while hovering, I want to go ahead and load this thing here. So uh, this was a pretty easy thing for me to set up, and I'll just show you really quick. On this hover state, we'll go ahead and undo this so we can redo this work really quick so we can teach as we go. So on this button here, I would like for it to show this darker state like this here when it's hovering. Let me actually undo some of this so that we can kind of get at this. All right, so what I'd like to do is just drag out a little prototype noodle, as we call them internally. And I want to say while hovering. And instead of the typical like navigate to another frame, what I'd like to do is I'd like to open an overlay. That's something that exists on top of the UI that is here. And then I would like to position that manual. You can use overlays for a lot of things like popping up modals and things like that, slide out navigation drawers. Tom's going to share some of that. But I'm going to go ahead and just say manual position, and I just want it to be right on top of this item. I can also use my keyboard keys to nudge this. I didn't know that before, but I just figured that out. So let's just go ahead and see what we built. Let's see what this interaction looks like. Oops, maybe I actually ripped this. Ooh, what did I do? I must have nudged something else. All right, let's redo this thing. All right. Tom, oh, I backed up. Okay, we're opening the overlay. It's going to be manual. It's going to be on top of it. All right, let's not see me flounder anymore. If you're ever wondering like, wow, this thing looks so small on the screen, I can go ahead and go to my options here, and I can go ahead and scale up or down to fit. You can use that Z command. So that's exactly what I wanted. As soon as I overlay, that thing gets that hover state. Cool, we're one step in. Now let's go ahead and rig up this menu. So on this secondary one, this is the one that's being shown as an overlay. What I'd like to do is open this menu. So I'm going to go ahead and have an on-click interaction here, or an on-tap in this case with the iOS. And so I'm going to go on tap. Once again, we're going to open an overlay, and we're going to position this right above this menu here, or above this hover state. We could go ahead and have that smart animated if we'd like. Move in like this. We could have it move in from the bottom, something like that. We're not going to do that. We're just going to have a pretty instant experience. Let's just go ahead and test how that works. Okay, once again, there's our hover. You can see now that my mouse has turned into a little pointer hand. And if I click it, there I go. So this is a cool way that you can achieve a couple of different things. One, a hover state, two, a click state, all with overlays in your mockups. All right. So what you didn't know is that this is actually an instance of this component. I'm going to go one level deeper and say, how can we demonstrate hover states on this little menu that pops up? And so what I've done here is I've taken this master component and I've gone ahead and rigged up these prototype line. I don't know why I like to say rigged, but it just sounds cool. I'm originally from Montana, and I think that's a word we use a lot. What we've done here with this top one is I've said on tap, we're going to go ahead and swap this whole overlay. Now, swaps work really great specifically with overlays. It'll take an overlay and completely swap that thing out. It's kind of like an instant swap. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say, I'm going to go ahead and swap it out with this version of that. And all I did is just apply an instance override on this one here specifically to have that selected state. What I've also done here is I've rigged up this one here. There's me with that rig word again. And I have said while hovering, swap with this one. That way I get two different interactions that I can demonstrate to my developers, and we can actually kind of feel it out. But that would be the hover state here, and this would be the click state or the selected state. And remember that both of these ended up using the swap. What swap's going to do, if you're in an overlay, is it's going to swap out that specific object overlay. If you're actually doing swap in a frame, it'll actually swap out the whole frame. So let's come back here and let's see. We'll restart our prototype. Let's see if we've got the glory. Oh, hover, yeah. Click, menu's open. All right, and look at that. I've got a hover state right here, but I've also got a click state. So when I click it, you can see what it's done is swap that overlay out. You can also see that when I hover this lower one, that it's actually not representing this state here because it's swapping out this one here. So it is a little bit limited in what you can do, but these are great ways to be able to use overlays, to be able to demonstrate menus, and to be able to demonstrate some dynamism in, is that a word? I think it is. I made it a word. Some dynamism inside of your mockups. I think that's enough for me. I want to pass this one on to Tom.
All right. There's a couple of different things I'm going to cover, so maybe I'll kind of do two at once. One I was going to use to show you how to make a nav drawer with a drag interaction. But there was also a question by Label Logic about adding scrolling to overlays. So maybe because the question's relevant, I'll tackle both of those if that's cool with you, Raji.
That's great. Also, that is a great question, and I'm surprised we didn't actually. Actually, we did cover some of this. Go for it, Tom. Take it away.
Yeah, while you were going, I just built a little scrolling overlay example so we can demonstrate that.
You did it while I was going.
Yeah, so.
All right, go.
Hopefully this goes well. Okay, so one of the things that you may want to do is, one of the things I like about overlays is there's a bunch of different ways to use them. So Raji just showed you one. This is another really common pattern where you may want to have sort of like a hamburger menu that brings out sort of like a nav drawer from the side. And so there's a couple of different types of interactions that come in handy when using something like this. So the first is when we want to link up our hamburger menu, we can switch over to our prototyping tab. And the idea is that we want to link to this frame that just like sits outside the rest of our frames. The nice thing about this is that, you know, as I build out the prototype and get more and more screens, they're all going to link back to that same nav drawer. So there's no reason for me to sort of like, you know, put this nav drawer inside my frame and like have it kind of shifted off to the screen and then kind of animate it in every time with Smart Animate. There are instances where you may use that sort of pattern, but the nice thing about this is that it just gives you sort of like one place out on the canvas. It's easy to see how it's connected to other elements, and then you can edit it in one place and without having to sort of like duplicate that artwork in any of your other frames. And so once we've made this little connection, here, let me get rid of these other two because we don't need them right now. Once we've made this connection, the default connection that it's going to create is basically on click to navigate to this. In this case, like Raji said, we don't want to navigate to it. We want to open it as an overlay. One of the nice things I like is that in this overlay position here, you basically have a bunch of really common ones. So for like a dialog box, you might use centered. And then for like a top sheet or something that slides down like an alert or something, you may use to sort of top center. And then for like nav drawers, top left and top right are like great defaults. And you can see the most common ones here, you can also choose from this little option strip here, where you can choose center, top left, and bottom center, which is like really useful for a bottom sheet. So those are the kind of like the three common ones that we've tried to sort of like surface here so that you don't have to dig into the menus. And then if you want that background scrim to show up, like maybe the rest of the screen darkens a little bit, that's where you'd control that here. And then if you want it to be dismissible, you would keep this box checked. So now if we open up our prototype here, then you'll see that now when we click this, it's going to open our overlay. Now, if we come back to our close button here, you'll see that it already has an interaction where we can add a click interaction, and then we can say close overlay, and then that's going to essentially just reverse the exact opposite thing that you did. So that'll be set to close overlay, and then you'll be able to see when we click it, it now closes and reverses that animation. On your original interaction, you can define what that animation is. So in this case, I've used sort of like a move in so that it moves in from the right. But there may be situations where maybe you want this to sort of just dissolve. But if you have a move in, a lot of times it sort of sets up the user for this expectation that they can swipe to do something. So there may be instances where you want to add an interaction that says, you want to add another interaction to the frame itself. So this frame itself, where we say on drag, close overlay. And so what that'll allow us to do when we go back into our prototype is launch it And then what I can do is now just by dragging, it's going to reverse that animation, but it'll actually close it when I release.
I noticed
So
also
now
that it reverses the fade as well. So instead of just like an instantaneous fade, it like slowly fades out that little scrim.
Yeah, no, and that's sort of like nice because I remember kind of like pre-overlays. Often I was like mocking up the overlay on a separate screen, and you have to like create that scrim. So it's nice that Figma just allows you to specify like a color value and an opacity, and then it does that for you and handles all of the transitioning for it. The other question that I was going to address was around scrolling overlays. So I'm kind of jumping ahead here because we're going to cover a little bit of this stuff in some of the other demos as well. But I put together just like kind of like a quick dialogue from some stuff that I had lying around, and I'm going to show you 2 examples here. And the idea here is that we're going to click this button and we're going to launch this as an overlay, more of sort of like a dialogue type of overlay, and we're going to show you how to create a scrolling interaction within this. So if you've ever created scrolling frames in Figma, which we'll show you in one of the examples today, when it comes to overlays, you kind of want to handle it in a bit of a different way. An overlay is essentially going to take this frame and place it over top of your design. And so your viewport is still defined by this sort of like initial frame that you visit in the prototype. And so in order to handle scrolling in this instance, what you want to do is have a nested frame within your overlay. So in this case, you can see I have this little nested frame. And if we go into the design mode, you'll see that this frame does not have the clip content box checked. If I clip that, it's actually going to hide the contents that sort of exceed the boundaries of that frame. So you can almost think of this almost like in CSS, where you put a bunch of objects inside like a fixed position frame. And if you set sort of like the overflow properties, you can have the elements just continue stacking horizontally and exceed the boundaries of the frame, kind of like without any wrapping behavior. And so if you hide, like overflow hidden, you would see those things. So it's kind of a similar concept. But the nice thing is much like you would in CSS, if you go into the prototyping tab on that frame, what we can do is we can enable scrolling behavior on that overflow content. So in this case, we have more of a carousel. And so we probably want to set up horizontal scrolling, and then we'll turn off our clip content, and you can see we now have this little separate frame with another nested frame within it that has that scrolling behavior. And if we now link up our button to the overlay, we can say on tap, open overlay, we want it to be centered. Maybe it's not going to be dismissible, and we'll add our little background scrim, and maybe this thing moves up from the bottom. So I've set my animation settings here. It's gonna, if I switch the easing, it'll ease in and ease out, and the whole transition is gonna take us 300 milliseconds. So now, when I press play, and I'm probably on the wrong size device here. Or I didn't refresh. Yeah, I probably picked the wrong size device or set my frame up incorrectly, but you'll still see the same thing. There's my overlay, and now I can actually scroll within that overlay. And so this example is obviously a horizontal scrolling overlay, but you might have an overlay that pops up where you have like a form that somebody has to fill out, and maybe they have to scroll within that overlay. And that's basically what I've tried to set up here. And so essentially, if I change this interaction to go to this one, select this nested frame, and set my scrolling instead of horizontal this time to vertical. When we go back here, whoops, I didn't set that to open as an overlay, my bad. There we go. So now this will launch. I can use my scroll wheel, or I can drag, and it sort of like emulates that sort of like iOS movement. So that's basically how I would typically set up a sort of scrolling interaction inside an overlay. So hopefully that helps. Definitely sort of like explore some of those properties that you can use frames for. And I think Raji's going to show another example of that with a map as well.
Yeah, we've got a couple of, I'll hop into one of the examples as well that's also a horizontal scroll. and using the power of components with built-in, essentially any frame with a built-in scrollable region that's reusable is super, super, I don't know, it's easy and it's fast. So I'll show that off. Are you done with this one here, Tom?
Yeah,
Yeah, that was
feel free
super
to take
awesome.
it
Way
away.
to just whip that together. That was great. All right. All right. So yeah, so this one's pretty simple. It's amazing. I actually just showed this to a friend the other day, and it's amazing how quickly you can whip up a sort of multi vertical and horizontal scrolling map. And so we're just going to rebuild this from the ground up, but let's just get a little peek at the interactions and how it works, uh, and then we'll go rebuild it together. Okay, so this is essentially what it is. It's a scrollable map. You can move the map all over. You have a couple of uh, fixed points on the map here, and when you tap them, they should open a little overlay like that. So this is what we're going to build. Let's go ahead and rip apart these prototype connections and build this thing from the ground up. Actually, we will just leave them. I'm going to duplicate this here. Get rid of these prototype points. Tom, what's that handy command to rip off all the prototype points, the noodles from a frame? Is there one?
Yeah, so when you go into when you have the prototyping tab selected, if you just right click anywhere on the canvas or a particular frame, there's an option to remove connections. So if you click on a frame, it'll remove the connections that come to and from that frame. And then if you click somewhere on the canvas, you have the option to remove all of those connections.
That was super. I actually was looking for that everywhere the other day. Um, I would love for it to be in the little quick menu, just to be able to remove all connections. So I started typing in this quick menu to see, and I was like, where did it go? I don't remember. Okay, so let's build this thing from the ground up. So I'm literally going to just delete this, move these little points off of here. I'm going to go into outline mode because I know there's all kinds of other stuff here hidden in this layer. So I'm going to go to design, turn off clip content, and just work within this one frame. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and use a plugin called Mapsicle, which is super fun. We'll go ahead and just define it to be about 2000 by 2000. I'm going to create the map. What Mapsicle will do is just create a frame with that map as the background image. On our frame here, we're going to go ahead and turn on clip content, which is on by default. And if I just drag this map in here into the center, it'll get clipped in there. Now, all I have to do is simply go to this frame in prototyping mode and make sure that I turn on the behavior here for scrolling for horizontal and vertical. I'm going to move the playhead here. Typically, you can only have a one-to-one relationship with pages over here and prototypes. But I can go ahead and work within this file by just dragging that little playhead over here. And now I can actually see this one in action. Let's see if it works. Yep, sure works. All right, let's come back here. We're gonna start adding on a few points into this frame. So we're gonna do one right here in the Haight-Ashbury, one in Daly City, and one in Brisbane. Okay, and if we check that prototype, you can see that they're all moving here. Now, if I ever wanted one of those points to be fixed for whatever reason, or say I needed a menu up here, so let's just simulate, maybe you had a little round menu icon and maybe it was up here. Let's go ahead and just change that to white. Maybe add a little shadow on it. The problem with this is that this becomes one of the scrolls that's on the map. All super easy. All we have to do there is just fix the position when scrolling, and this will fix the position within that frame. So if I come back here, you can see as I scroll, that little menu thing is still there. Okay, now I heard that rigging up is actually a 3D animator's term, and it makes a lot of sense, so I'm sticking with it. We're going to go to prototype here, and I'm going to go ahead and say, I want to go ahead and say this little menu should open, and I'm going to open the overlay, and I'm going to manually position. So I'll just drag it right up there like that. This one here, I'm going to do the same, and I'm going to open the overlay, make it manually positioned, and then add it there. All right, we'll just do that as an exercise for now. Now you can see that we still got our prototype here. It's still dragging. But if you ever feel a little bit lost within a prototype and you don't know, like, well, what's interactable? Simply just click the prototype and you'll see that little blue boxes will highlight around the things that are hot spots. So if I open this, you can see, wow, this is great. There's that one. And if I open this one, it works and it actually scrolls with the map, which is super, super rad. It's a really simple demonstration, but there's a lot that you can do with that fixed positioning, with opening overlays, but also with using vertical and horizontal scrolls. And that's going to be mine. I want to pitch it back to Tom.
Cool. I'm going to go back to sort of like maybe it's sort of a simpler one that's been in existence for a while in Figma, only because it comes up in a lot of questions that I hear from users, and that is, how do I make scrolling prototypes like outside of overlays? The setup is pretty simple. And so this may be sort of like a repeat of stuff that some of you watching already know. But there's one little technique that I like to do that satisfies, I think, some of the ways that people like to design when working on mobile. So let's start with the basic setup. So I've got this is an Android sized device, I believe. Yep, I've switched to my sort of Android thing here. And then my device is a Google Nexus 5X. And I've got this bottom nav and this top status bar. So my status bar, the first thing that I did was set up my constraints. So I set those up to left and right and top. And I checked this box, fixed position when scrolling, and it did the exact same thing except with a bottom constraint for this here nav bar at the bottom. Now, with those constraints set up, what that allows us to do is obviously scroll this frame vertically. And what we can do is just elongate this frame to accommodate more content. So essentially, if you have a Nexus 5 device selected, and we go in here and select the Android device, the height of it is 640. And so any sort of like additional height that you add onto this frame that is beyond 640, it's going to treat that as scrollable content, and it will keep this and this anchored to the top and bottom of the viewport. So to kind of demonstrate that, one thing that a lot of people will do is they'll put their content in here. So these are just going to be some placeholders for images. And maybe we'll use our Unsplash plugin and use a little quick command, and we'll populate this with some beautiful plant pictures. That'll take a second just to populate those. All right, now we got some plants in here, and some of my content's cut off a little bit, so I'm going to make this a little bit longer so that we have some buffer at the bottom. And then what you'll see when I launch my prototype is a scrolling prototype. So now I'll be able to scroll vertically through all of that content. Now this is great, but one thing that often comes up when you're doing this is that sometimes users will say, but I kind of want to get a sense of like what's within the viewport, before a user scrolls. So maybe you have some critical UI elements or something that you're designing, and you want to get a sense, especially on smaller devices, how much of the UI or how much of my content is going to be seen on a smaller device. And so one of the things that I like doing is taking all of my content outside of the frame. And then one of the things that I can do is actually just turn this into a component. So now we can rename this component to something like scrolling content. And then what I'll do is a little tip here. If you select any frame or component and hit enter, it'll select all of the children inside of it. So now I've selected all of these images. And I'm going to set the constraints on these images to be anchored to the top and the left and right. And so that means like if I decide to make these things bigger, those rectangles that have image fills on them are going to sort of like scale with that overall content. Now that I've set up the constraints, one of the things that we can use is our good old friend from the previous sort of example that I showed, which is using this clip content feature. And so with that, what that means is if I make an instance of this and I scroll this up or down, it's going to hide the rest of that content. And now what we could do is coming back here, we could just turn on our vertical scrolling that we did with the frames, but this time on a component. So what that enables us to do is go back to our phone, set this to our default device size, and then we can now put this instance of the component on our frame, and we can just size this to basically be the same size as the scrolling content. And so now what this allows us to do is it gives us a full-length view of all of the content that's going in on the screen. If we need to add more, we can extend this component down. we can add another image. And then because this component is just getting mirrored here, this will allow us to sort of get a preview in the viewport, but also give us a full length view of where we're going to edit the content. And now when you come back into your prototype, you're basically going to get the exact same experience that you did before, except this time you'll have sort of like both views. And I found this little trick helps a lot because now you can just sort of like at all times without having to sort of like resize your viewport or go into here and click different viewport sizes. You can now get a sense of what that's going to look like. And of course, with this nested, this component that's in the design, we can also set up constraints on it as well. So we could say, left and right and top and bottom. And so, as you are thinking of like different device sizes, if I just switch these device sizes to like Google Pixel 2 or Pixel XL, I can get a sense of what's going to be in the viewport really, really quickly without having to rejig any of the content. And one other sort of like segue into that when you're trying to get a sense of what this is going to look like on different devices, there's a really cool plugin. I think we've talked about this before, but it's called Responsify, made by Brian Levin. And so in this case, if I wanted to say, what is this design going to look like on all of the common Android devices, I can click on Responsify's Android option, and it will build out all of those sort of like key viewport sizes alongside my initial screen so that I can sort of quickly get a preview of what those are going to look like.
It seems like with that plugin too, you just have to make sure that you've set up your constraints within that frame in the right way. So they'll stretch right and all that, but once it's ready, it's ready.
Yeah, so the constraints are a big part of that. So like it's essentially just automating the behavior that you get here when you're like resizing it manually. But it's just a nice way when you're kind of like just kind of trying to do a quick gut check and you're like, okay, I know this isn't an Android frame, but you're like, what's it going to look like in all the iPhone sizes? And then you can just quickly hammer that out. And sometimes it's just like a nice way of being able to make those changes. And again, because you've made this a component, the other benefits to this kind of workflow is that now like you could come in here and I could switch these around using smart selections or add some new content or make some modifications, and that's going to update across all of those viewports. So that's a huge time saver for me just when I just want to sort of get a sense of what things are going to look like
Yeah, I
on different
absolutely
devices.
love that, like the fact that components and frames can contain within them rules for scrolling and all of that. Uh, and then you can sort of reuse this content like you were doing for like responsive stuff, which is awesome.
Yeah, for sure. I think there were some questions in there too. I know
Yeah.
somebody wanted to know if we could zoom in a bit. So I don't know if you're able to do that on your end, Raji, because I know you're controlling the screen.
Yeah, I think
Screen.
you'll
I'll
just
leave
have
that to
to
you.
zoom in a little bit more as you're presenting, because even on the screen, as I see here, it's a little bit small. So get in a little bit closer. I can't really do too much.
Yeah, I couldn't tell if it's the UI as well. If I need to like, I don't know, go to a smaller resolution or something, but thank you for the feedback on that. We'll try to make sure, and I'll try to zoom in more as
Yep.
well. And then somebody asked, let's say I'm designing for Android. Now I have a screen ready, but now I want to resize it for iOS. How do you do that? Well, I mean, one consideration is obviously going to be, whether or not you're going to switch out some of or include some of the iOS and Android sort of like platform UI in your mockups. Some people do, some people don't. If you're not, that's a lot easier. You can set up the resizing constraints on all of your different elements. And then all you really have to do is like make a copy of a frame, and you can, quickly switch to any of these viewports, and it'll automatically sort of like adjust the design.
Awesome.
But then depending on your workflow as well, I've seen some people that have done some sort of like clever component setup in their own team libraries where, maybe this nav bar and the status bar are like combined as a component, and they might have like an Android version and an iOS version. And then they might, come in here, select those things, and then quickly swap them out for the iOS version. But yeah, there's lots of different ways that you can handle that, but hopefully that helps.
Yeah, it was great. I'm just looking to see if there's any other questions that we can handle.
I'm having a look too.
So yeah, Camilla Jan says, can they put an overlay on there that scrolls along with the images? And I think that's kind of a similar one to the map one, but I think you could probably demonstrate that.
Yeah, so let me go back to like your map one. I'll grab one of these little tooltips. And yeah, so the nice thing is you could just have your tooltip out here. And then maybe on one of these images, you could say, I want to link this up to as an overlay. One thing that you'll notice, and I think Raji, this is probably on your agenda to talk next. It's sort of like the
Mm.
master component will automate some of those connections, but we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. And then instead of navigating to it, I'm going to open an overlay, and then I want that overlay to be manually positioned. So maybe I want this to, I don't know, appear in the center of this particular card, and I want that to happen on tap. And what's our transition? Maybe we'll just do a dissolve. And again, I switched my my device viewport here, and I need to change my starting frame. You'll notice that because I started making my first interactions from this component, it's trying to use my component as a starting frame. And in this case, I want it to be this little Android phone. So again, I'll size that, make sure that the right Android phone is selected, and then I'll come back and refresh. So now you can see there's my scrolling prototype. And if I click on that, there's my my tooltip, and that tooltip stays anchored. And I don't have to repeat that interaction a bunch of times because we used a component. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. There's another question. I think we'll try to see if we can address it later, which is, unless you have like a really quick example, which is there a way to simulate like a zooming in to the map, like on a pinch or on like a even a tap or something like that? Is there a way to simulate zooming on a map?
Um, yeah, I'll try to throw something together really quick here. All right, let's do an iPhone 8. Um, So one thing that you could do is you could basically take a giant box. Let's just see if how quickly we can simulate this. And I'm going to populate this with a map using the Mapsicle plugin. So let's just put a big old map of San Francisco on this shape. And then one of the things that we could do is, put this thing in the frame, and then we could take another frame, and then this is where you could like actually, size this up sort of like that. And then you could kind of fake it a little bit with a drag interaction. So you could say like, when you drag on this frame, go to this frame. And then what you might use is like the smart animate transition. And so what that's going to do is it's sort of like animate this box to this size. And then let's just see what it looks like. Launching the
Prototyping,
prototype here.
prototyping on the fly. I love it.
Yeah, I don't know how realistic this is going to look, but basically you have this map, and then when I've dragged it, it kind of does that zoom in. And then of course we could take an interaction that goes back that says like on drag, smart animate back, and so you could get something that looks like this, just with a drag interaction. So that might be like a good way to kind of like simulate that. And then maybe there's like you could see the potential as well, where maybe on this frame there's like some other UI elements that appear when you get to a different zoom level. So
Totally. Was thinking the same thing.
yeah, so maybe there's like obviously this is just like gibberish that I'm designing, but um, yeah, maybe there's some other stuff that pops up, and so you could
Yeah.
imagine when you get into that level, those things appear, and Figma will handle those just by crossfading them if they don't exist on the other frames. And then of course, if this box did exist on this frame, like maybe it's just like, I don't know, like some little thing that sits over here. I don't know what I'm designing, but you get the idea. When you do that drag interaction.
You're
Oh, see, there's
inventing the
a,
next forward-thinking map UI. You didn't even know it.
I'm going to rename these two things the same as well. And I'm just going to call this, I don't know, highlight. That way these things share names, and that will correct the little animation error that we saw in the past one. So now that little box just sort of animates. And it's a nice quick way of being able to simulate those things. So hopefully that's useful for y'all.
Totally. And that's one thing, oftentimes, if you're duplicating layers and you're trying to take one object and put it into another layer, sometimes those names may get messed up or they'll auto increment. and you'll notice that they're just doing this strange fade. And that's what Tom did, is he just ensured that both of those objects had the same name. And then Smart Animate knows like, oh, these two are the same thing, so we're going to transition them, position, size, whatever, across those two strains. All right.
Why don't you continue on with your examples, and I'm going to just take a look at the questions, and if there's any other little examples that I can throw together while you're presenting, I will.
Yeah, these are going to be pretty fast. Right now, Figma doesn't have states built into it, but just wait. But currently, and this is a way that I've worked in my mockups, like say you have this navigation here, it's on a desktop device, and you'd like to be able to have a hover state and then like a click state to go to it. We kind of represented that in the beginning with that swap and overlay, but just want to show you real quickly how that might work. Over here, I've got a nav item, and I've simply, and I can just disconnect this thing here, I've simply taken this prototype noodle, connect it to this frame, and this frame basically represents the hover state. So I want my text to go purple. I also have a little bit of a transparent highlight behind it. And so I'm going to go ahead and say on tap, I'd like to go ahead and open an overlay and then manually position it. And it's by default, it's just going to show up right on top of that object. And that's exactly what I want. I want it to on tap, just go ahead and put that overlay on there so I can simulate a hover. And then on this frame here, what I'd like to do on that overlay as it's hovering, if somebody chooses to click that item, I'd like to go ahead and add an on tap navigate to this other state here. I could also do this with components and swaps and overrides and things like that. That would be completely fine if I'd like to do that. But just wanted to show you this case for demonstrating sort of some light hover effects as well as going to a new frame. Right now, Figma doesn't allow you to be able to take one object and connect two noodles to it. So the idea might be that you would say, hey, on this navigation item, I would like to be able to attach two actions to it. One, when you hover, do this, but two, when you click, do this. And right now, Figma can't do that. Hopefully in the future it can. I would love that. I'd like to be able to do all sorts of things. But let's go ahead and run this prototype and see what this now does. All right, so here's the situation. Let's just make sure. I may not have done, I did on tap. I'd like to do while hovering. So let's change that. And you can see now that I've got a little dissolve transition here on my while hovering, and it shows my hover state. Now, if I'd like to click this, what happens? Boom, there's the nav that it's selected and we're in that area. So that's a really simple little tip. I think we have plenty more, so I'd like to create space to move on and go. Tom, are you up next with that bottom sheet, or do we have any questions to answer?
I was just getting ready to try and answer one of the questions, and it's a bit of a hacky solution, but I'm willing to put it on the line as a potential option.
Okay.
All right. If you, hopefully I'm sharing now.
You're sharing.
Somebody was asking is if there's a way to create sort of like a scroll interaction where like the overlay appears as you scroll down, and there's not really a good way to do it. We have got that request quite a few times, so I would love for us to be able to have like more like scroll position type drivers. Depending on what the use case is for your prototype, like maybe you're just trying to put together just sort of like a rough idea to show somebody. There is a couple of ways that you can do it, kind of. And so I'll show this at the risk of not necessarily recommending this as like a one-stop solution, but essentially I have this is like an iPhone 11 size frame, and I've scaled it downwards. So basically where this box starts is the bottom of the frame, or the bottom of the viewport. And then this stuff below here is basically scrolling content. And so one of the things that I've seen users do is they'll say, they'll change the layer opacity to be 0. So now you have this invisible box, and then they'll create a prototype connection here to open this thing as an overlay. And then you'll position it to say like, bottom center, and then the interaction is while hovering. And so the idea is that, the user's cursor is here, and when they scroll down, it hovers the cursor over this thing, and then this thing appears at the bottom of the screen. So it's not the nicest solution, but basically you can get that that sort of thing where you're scrolling down, and then the thing appears, and when you scroll down, the thing appears. So you can kind of see that little hotspot there. and then it goes away. So it's not ideal, but like, faking it, some things like that can come in handy for conveying some of those interactions.
Absolutely. And I've got another example to show of something very similar to this, um,
Cool.
that does sort of like a reveal top nav as you scroll down. So we can show that too later.
Oh, well, why don't you switch to that one now? And then you can,
Then it's all within context. Yeah, totally. Let me
yeah.
see if I found it here. Um, let's see. Okay, so this one is just a little bit more detailed. Uh, Same idea as Tom's saying. So kind of get yourself in that mindset. We've got this big box. Now I went ahead and just sort of made it a little bit transparent, but I made it still red so you know when we actually hover it. And you can see here that I've got a mouse enter on it. And in this situation, what I did is I said, it's a little bit different scenario. This is a scenario where you're on a desktop website, you've got the nav, but you don't want a fixed nav. You essentially want to let a bigger nav move out of the way. Maybe it's like a big presentational marketing nav. And then you've got this other nav here. Let's say it's a little bit smaller. I'll make it smaller that you want to kind of drop in as you scroll down. So this is what I've done here. I've went ahead and rigged up this box here that is a scrollable box. So as this viewport scrolls up, this will reveal and your mouse will trigger it. And then it says on mouse enter, navigate to this next frame here. Uh, but the one thing that you might be wondering is like, well, if we navigate to that frame and we have all these things in the actual UI, what happens to all those objects on the screen? Are they going to reset the position back at the top? That's not a great experience. But let's try out the gate what that may look like. So we'll go ahead and just see what this might look like. So as I scroll, you can see that this is not a fixed nav. And as I scroll, and as soon as my mouse goes over that, it actually brings down that little nav. But unfortunately, we've got all that content that's shoved up to the top again. And I remember when I first did it, a little trick like this, I was like, well, this isn't a really great experience to show someone. Here's the trick. On this one, just make sure that you click this preserve scroll position. And wherever your content is, especially if it's the same exact content as over here, which this is, you'll notice that we'll go ahead and restart this prototype, as you scroll, that nav will come down in a really sort of soothing way. And it's a good way to pass this off to your developers and say, hey, this is kind of the interaction that I'm looking for. And then of course, on this one, just to explain how this works, as soon as this navigates to this frame, what I've done is I've said, open that overlay, and I've done it after a delay. So essentially what happens is your mouse hovers over the red box, it moves to the next frame, and then after a millisecond delay, which is pretty much immediately, it opens this overlay. And on this overlay, what it does, you can see here, we'll click this little prototype noodle. It actually says move in from that top. That may be familiar by now. Move this thing in from the top and then take 300 milliseconds to get there. So that's another way that you can simulate that. Back to you, Tom.
Cool. So the next one that I wanted to show was just this idea of stitching a lot of these things together into one prototype. And so what I've done is I've recreated sort of a little mock-up here, just kind of like tracing some screenshots of the Spotify app. And so what I thought I would do is go through a couple of the different interactions really quickly that we've already covered and a couple of new ones, and then kind of watch how it all sort of like stitches together in a working prototype. So the first screen is this home screen here, and you can see there's all of this content that exceeds the frame, which is a result of that clip content thing that I turned earlier. Each one of these sections in my layers panel, let me close my pages here, is sort of like its own frame. So, recently played, made for you. This one should probably be called top podcasts. And then inside it, I've got a scrollable frame, which is where sort of these album covers sit. So I'm going to set the horizontal scrolling behavior on all of these. That'll give us that sort of like horizontally scrolling carousel type of behavior. A few of the interactions from this main nav are pretty standard prototyping transitions, so I'm not going to go into a lot of details about those. But where I do want to go into details is right in here where we have basically this little menu that sits across all of these pages. And so what I've done is each one of these, basically it's the same layers across all 3 of these frames. But of course, we change the color values on the text so that one is highlighted, and we move the position and the width of this little indicator line across all of them. And so once I've sort of set that up, all I have to do is say, when you click on artists, I want to go to this screen. And one of the things that you can do here is you can combine standard transitions like a move in, move out, push, or a slide in with Smart Animate. So what that will do is it'll say like, hey, all of these, all of these playlist covers here don't exist on this frame. So I'm going to apply a normal push transition to them. But for this menu up here with this little indicator, we're going to use the Smart Animate. So you can combine the two.
I
And
love
so in
that.
this case,
Yeah, it's
yeah,
amazing.
so I'll say push. I want this screen to kind of slide in from the right, and then we're going to match those animated layers. And it's basically the exact same interactions if we want to shoot all the way over here to go to the albums. Again, push transition, it's going to come in from the right-hand side, so the transition moves to the left. We'll Smart Animate those matching layers. And then we could come back in here. We could do the same thing for playlist. Of course, it's going to move in the opposite direction, but the exact same push transition. And again, for albums, it's going to be this direction, and then we can quickly come back and link these things up. So this takes us to artists, and this takes us to playlists. So once you've set all those up, the other thing that you may want to have is like sometimes there's multiple ways to interact on a screen, and you'll see on each of these frames, basically I have a containing frame that contains all of the content for this particular screen. And if we look in here, this is sort of like an example that we did earlier on the carousels, but each one of these frames also has this vertical scrolling overflow behavior. So this is sort of like nice where each of the content in these screens is sort of like nested within each of those frames without having to sort of like have all these different frames that have varying heights. Sometimes it just makes it a little cleaner to lay out. And what I've done on each of these is they actually have a drag interaction on them. And so you can see here, if we drag, we can do that same push transition that goes to this screen. And again, if we drag over here, it's going to go this direction and so on and so forth. And then up here, we have another really similar transition, which does a push transition to take us all the way to the podcast section. And so one of the nice things is once you sort of like stitch all these things up and you preview your prototype, you get a pretty sort of like natural feeling prototype. So this one might take a second to load.
I
I've
love
got all
that
sorts of
drag
different...
thing too. I didn't even know that you had set that up, but that's amazing.
Yeah, so here we can see our prototypes all loaded. And so these little carousels, each one of these is like an independent carousel, but I can also scroll this way as well. And then, of course, the tabs across the bottom will also sort of just do like a basic transition into those sections. So now here we are on search, and here we are on library, where we just wired up those interactions. And so you can see here, just using my scroll wheel or dragging up and down, I can still sort of like navigate each one of these screens. But if I click and navigate between these screens, I get that nice left to right transition with this little indicator that sort of like scales and highlights the right menu item. And then, of course, as I said, we can also do drag interactions on them as well. So there you go. You can see I'm just, instead of clicking on these menu items, I'm just sort of swiping between them. And then again, up here, I can switch over to podcast, and I can have a little interaction within the podcast section as well.
That is so cool. Also, I'm pretty impressed with the lack of frames needed to pull that all off. That's pretty amazing.
Basically, there's one frame for each one of the screens, and there's not a lot of like sort of like in between screens. And I mean, there's quite a few little prototyping interactions, but I think the one example that you haven't gone into as much detail yet is with the components, which obviously can help speed some of that stuff up.
Oh yeah, let me hit that one up. Where was I on that one? Oh, okay. Sure. I had a couple of things to share on this one. We're basically at time, but I want to share everything that we possibly can. So I don't care if we go over. You okay, Tom, to go over a little bit?
Yeah, I'm okay to go over.
Rad. Okay, it's fun. This is super fun. I love this stuff. Okay, so let's first talk about inheriting prototype noodles from a master component that can actually speed a lot of this up. So in this situation, let's actually just duplicate these down. I want to show this off, but I have a couple of different things to show off there. I'm going to use Tom's handy dandy trick here, remove connections. And I'm going to go ahead and take these 3 different components here, and I'm going to swap them out. Let's see here. Oh, those were frames, so I can't be swapping those out. I'm going to go ahead and put this, let me zoom in just to be kind to you all. I'm going to go ahead and put this one here. I'm going to put my constraints on the left and on the bottom. I'd like this thing to be a fixed position item. I'm going to go ahead and copy this and then just paste into here and here. And it should have all those qualities associated with it. I don't have to reset fixed position or those left and right bottom constraints. So this is kind of a normal way that I might go about putting a nav into a mockup. And let's say that this nav came from this component over here. Let's say this is a team library. This team library has a ton of different assets and bits and pieces that I can use, but I've went ahead and grabbed that. Let's go back here. And so my typical way that I might rig up something like this is that I would go to prototype just in the way that Tom was showing. This is kind of intuitively how I would go about it, is I would just say, okay, well, this Explore tab goes here. And then this account tab goes here. And then I would be working over in this one here and I'd be like, oh, I got to reset those again. So then this goes here. Sure, I might actually get really smart and realize, oh, wait, I've already got these things set up here, all of these little things. And I want to go ahead and copy this and put this in here. And then I see that it actually keeps those relationships. But here's a little hack and something that's really cool. Let's go ahead and I'm going to take this, this component here. Now this is coming from my design system. So my design system doesn't already have those noodles set up for me, as you can see here by default. But I'm going to go ahead and Command Option G, and that creates a frame around this. And then I'm going to go ahead and create this into a component. I probably could have just created it into a component right off the bat. So I'm going to do that here. Just make this into a component. Essentially what I'm doing here is I'm wrapping a component in a component instance in another component. And from the master, so this is about inheriting instances of components and instances of a nav, inheriting the noodles from the master. So I can come here now and just draw out my connections in the master. So I'm going to do my recipes, explore, and then this goes to account. Now I'm going to take this and I'm just going to alt drag this thing in here. Actually, I'm not going to do that because I didn't want to do it that way. I'm going to copy it, paste it into here, and then use my align tools to get it back down on the bottom. And then I'm going to take this, I'm going to paste it into 2 other ones. Now, what you're going to witness here is nothing short of glory. As I turn on the prototype, you'll notice that all of those connections are all now present. And all of these things will just work through this sort of master-child relationship. So, and I always want to make an argument that they shouldn't be called master instances. It should be a master child or master slave. Come on, Tom, that was a joke. You were supposed to get that.
I was
Okay,
just
yeah,
putting together.
cue laughter.
Well, I was just putting together sort of like a little example of
I love it.
that somebody had asked for, and I was grabbing a past example that I had used before, so I could totally fail at this.
Cool. Well, I have one last thing to show, and then we'll pop on over to you.
Cool.
Now, there's another thing I'd like to do here. Remember how Tom had that cool little sliding bar that went across? Unfortunately, with components, it's pretty difficult to be able to move a position of an object like that if I had that little bar within the object. So what I did is I just brought in this local master here, and then all I did is I just wrapped it with a frame. So you can see here, I put it in a frame called new nav, and I put that little divider object in there. So that object is not within a component. If you don't know, objects within components and component instances, actually, you can't modify the XY position of those things very easily. So what I did is I just copied that new nav into here and then manually just moved this thing over to the right position on each one of them. We've already demonstrated how to do smart animate, so I'm just going to hit play on this. If I hit play on this prototype now, you'll see it's pretty cool that we've got that animating line that moves from frame to frame as I go, but also that all of these noodles are inheriting from the master. If you ever have a scenario where, for some reason, maybe it's a special, unique scenario where you don't want this noodle here to go to the account, it works just like any component instance override works. You can actually declare that this instance override does something different and just drag it off into a different area. All right, Tom, back to you. Let's see what you've whipped up.
All right. So I had this example that actually somebody was asking about sort of like having a search with a keyboard that pops up from the bottom. And I thought I'd walk through how I'd set that up in a sort of like a little example prototype that that I had created in the past. So basically, here's our menu overlay, just as we showed earlier. And then you'll see here, this is sort of like my home screen. So the idea is that when the user touches on this search destination field, there's an interaction that basically navigates to this frame. And so what that does is it places the focus on the search. And then this keyboard here is actually on this screen as well. So rather than do it with overlays, because I have multiple interactions that I want to happen, you'll see here, if we go in, you will see, I kind of have it selected here. The keyboard is actually like off screen, pushed off the bottom of the screen. And then on this screen, it like pops up. And then there's a interaction on this screen that basically when you touch anywhere on the keyboard, it basically populates the input with a sort of like a fake search query. We don't have live inputs yet in Figma, so sometimes this is one of the ways that I'll sort of like fake it. And then when you press, the next interaction is when you press on this go button, it does the search. I think originally I had a loading state over here, but it was on our staging server, so the image didn't come over. But you could imagine having some sort of like animated GIF as a loader here, and then it goes to this screen where the loader disappears, and then it auto advances to this screen.
I'm guessing you used
After,
probably after delay or something on that during the GIF
yeah,
screen.
exactly. I used an after delay function. And so the overall sort of like flow that you get is basically you click on here, your keyboard pops up, you click on the keyboard, the words pop up, you press go, it takes you to the screen where there's a loading screen, and then it brings in your search results. And then of course, you know, you could have some sort of navigation that like takes you back, and that just uses a smart animate transition to sort of like take you back. So there's a couple of different ways that we've seen people fake it, but hopefully that helps.
Yeah, that's super cool. Super cool. Tom, did you see that we had, did you see if we had any other questions as we were presenting?
I know somebody was asking, is there a roadmap page where we can see features being currently worked on? We don't have a roadmap page, but on a fairly regular basis, like quarterly, we've been doing a live stream with the PM team. And I think that's, I believe, up on YouTube or at least on Twitter, where you can go back and watch sort of like where we sort of like talked about a bit of a recap of some of the stuff that we launched earlier this year, and then some of the stuff that we're working on. There is a bunch of stuff in the works that I can't say too much about, but I know there was some questions about like prototyping features and being able to sort of like build interactions into components and things like that. We've definitely heard that feedback loud and clear, and yeah, it's a really common request that the team's thinking a lot about. So definitely stay tuned.
Awesome. And so what we're going to do here, and I'm just going to ask you if you're cool with this too, Tom. We've had a lot of requests in the chat for like, this is great. This would be really helpful. Can we leave? I'm going to go through this file and just make sure that we didn't disconnect anything. But I'm going to go ahead and publish this to the community for people to have. So if you're cool with it, Tom, we'll go ahead and publish that out. That way people can have this as an asset to learn from.
Yeah, no, that sounds good. You and I can go over and make sure it's all connected so that, you know, you don't end up diagnosing things that we forgot to link up.
Sounds
But yeah,
good.
that sounds good.
All right. Well, on that note, we're at the end of the stream, but y'all were great. You asked a lot of great questions, and Tom was great. Tom, I can't believe you actually whipped up examples like on the fly like that. I have to learn from you. Good work, and thanks so much for being a part of this.
Thank you so much for having me. These are always a blast to do. And for those of you who watch today, definitely continue bringing us your questions and we'll do our best to answer them. So Always a blast.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. Thanks for coming to office hours. Our next stream will be next week. It'll be on Monday. It'll be builded in Figma. So if you want to join us there, just head on out to figma.com/events, and any of our streams will be there, and you can go ahead and add them to your calendar. So we'd love it if you'd show up. We love all your questions. Thanks so much. And for now, office hours are closed. Thanks again.
Thanks all.